aided by the attention lavished on expensive refinement. Slide, please. What Greek architecture needed after the Peloponnesian War was a breakthrough, a revival of the experimental spirit of the 7th century, which would create an interest in new building materials, vaulting, and interior space. What prevented the breakthrough? Could it have been the architectural orders, or rather the cast of mind that produced them? The suspicion will not down that it was the very coherence and rigidity of these orders which made it impossible for Greek architects to depart from the established pattern. What had been their great strength in earlier days now became a tyranny. It remained for later ages to adapt the Greek orders to brick and concrete, to arched and vaulted construction. For such adaptation necessitated doing a certain amount of violence to the original character of the orders, and the Greeks, it seemed, were incapable of that. Clear the machine, please. In our review for today, we will return to the first culture that we studied, that of the Egyptians. In most of the cultures, we can break it down into 3 areas: architecture, decorative arts and painting, and the sculpture. The Egyptians, other than in their pyramids and their tombs, used the post and lintel method of building, the same as the Greeks did. This is the most basic type of building, where you erect 2 posts and cross it with the lintel or the beam across to form the ceiling. Most of the Egyptian structures were built more or less on a rectangular form, fairly heavy, that they did not decide how slim the columns could be, of what support it would take, and the massive stone columns rising up amply supported whatever roof structure they put over them. Any design that was placed or incised in the building or used on the columns was of a nature pattern. Slide, please. In the sculpture, most of it was for burial reasons or purposes. The figures are stiff. They express the whole body, sort of an archaic movement forward that we will see in later Greek sculpture. The eyes are fairly wide open in the sculpture, other than in the wood, where they allowed themselves a little more freedom of joining parts, was usually contained within sort of a massive solid block feeling or a cubic feeling of the figure. Slide, please. Their painting on walls, the tomb paintings, were delicate, sort of a fragile effect. They were all placed on a flat background. The feet all were on the same baseline. They used natural colored pigments to color the areas between the line drawing that designated the figures or the areas. If the figure was important enough, he stood alone in an erect stage, foot forward, head in profile, eye full face, and the shoulders turned full face, with the hips then swiveled again into a profile position. If they were a group of people of lesser importance, or slaves or mourners of that sort, then the Egyptian artist was not compelled to show the entire figure, and you get a feeling of overlapping shapes many times, and feelings of crowds of activity going on. These figures, where it wasn't so important to express every part of it, then became a little more active in their poses. Slide, please. Where the Egyptians were very much interested in the afterlife and prepared for death very carefully, the Mesopotamian cultures, those of Sumeria, Babylonia, and Assyria, were more material-minded. Especially the last of the cultures, the Assyrians, were warlike people that constantly battled to keep their possessions and delighted in showing the conquest of these battles in low relief carvings on the palace walls. Their architecture was mostly of wood and clay brick, which has not survived the centuries. What little is left is mostly Babylonian architecture, the glazed bricks that they used on the entrance walls to the city and decorating the palace walls with relief carvings in highly glazed colors. Slide, please. The real story, although probably propagandized and certainly enlarged upon, were the palace relief carvings that showed the conquest of the kings. Of course, they were glorified. You wouldn't be having something done unless it showed them to the best advantage. But even in all the brutality, there is a delicacy of the design, an overall pattern that covers areas. We still have the same primitive style of composition where things are placed on a flat surface, where the story is most important. No feeling of depth or perspective, but it is an all-over decorative pattern that tells the story of the kings. Slide, please. Then getting closer to the basis of our own culture, or the heritage of our own Western civilization, leaving the Eastern ideas, are the early Aegean islands and the three cultures there, the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean, and these were predecessors to the Greek cultures. In the archaic or the early Aegean islands, we first have these little idol figures of the Cyclades islands, and they're usually a female figure, probably a mother or fertility goddess symbol, fairly crude but geometric.
And then in the utilitarian pottery that they used, they had some marvelous nature shapes, such as this one with the octopus that is fairly freewheeling, covering the surface of the pottery. Pottery was to be used. There were ewers, jugs, water jugs, and later on, I'd like you to take note that this is sort of an asymmetrical design, although in this one they do have some fairly rigid concentric circles. But the design was sort of placed over where the artist started in one area and just filled the area as he went along. Later on, in the lecture on archaic Greek sculpture, where the Greeks then designed pottery in an extremely well-planned, absolutely concentric pattern on the urns that were used for funerary purposes. Slide, please. In their architecture, you have the Palace at Messina, which used the typical columns that were tapered shafts, tapered smaller at the bottom, and then had sort of a mushroom cap. These were painted in bright colors, but they were made of wood. The other style of architecture with the Aegeans was the beehive tombs made of the large rocks in this elliptical form of where you would have the entrance, and then usually the entrance with this huge stone lintel over the doorway, and then it made for the pediment, which was triangular. Many times it was filled with sculpture, usually of a cat form. Slide, please. In the classic, or in the archaic period, up to the classic period, there was no vase painting after 350 BC. This is one of the later designs. The earlier designs were pure geometric designs of concentric rings. The pottery is well defined and refined. It usually has two handles. And most of this pottery was for the purpose of oils that would then seep into the graves. They were placed on top of the tombs of the burial graves. And then offerings would be placed within the jar so that the oil, there was a hole at the bottom that the oil could seep down to the person buried there. But many times they would have stories from mythology painted on the vases. But from the very early, just pure geometric concentric lines to sort of figure type things to a much more finished work such as this one. Slide. Then in the archaic sculpture, you have several very distinct characteristics. You have the archaic smile, a sort of embryonic look on the face. They had to have the lips in a smiling position since the figure was not lifelike, to show life within the figure. The figure was stiff, although it was freestanding, it was not in movement. The choros, which were the nude male figures, had the left leg forward with equal weight distributed on both feet. In the female forms, where they're draped, the drapery has sort of a rigidity of pattern, of a repetition of pattern. Many times the braids, you would have the 3 braids of hair that came from the back over toward the front of the chest of the person. You have the sort of bulging eyes, and as I said, the sort of smile that indicated that there was life within the figure. In this one, the hand that's been broken off was a hand offering something. Slide, please. And then in the architecture of the period, you have basically the 3 column orders, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now, they very seldom use the Corinthian. The Doric was the early order. The Ionic was the more slender, graceful order. And the Corinthian, the Romans later picked up and used it much more than the Greeks did. But the Greeks were hindered by their perfectionism. They did not, as I mentioned in the lecture, they sacrificed the inner space for this monumental exterior. They were only satisfied with the post and lintel type construction. It is not until later, when the Romans introduced the arch, that they were able to span greater areas. But the Greeks were interested in the proportion of the building, and it's like the Parthenon is built on that golden mean formula of 1 to 1.618, that the whole building was in this key, or this ratio. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
May I have your attention, please? This tape is on archaic Greek art. Put in the first slide, please. The works of art we have come to know so far are like fascinating strangers. We approach them fully aware of their alien background. As soon as we reach the Greeks, our attitude undergoes a change. They are not strangers, but relatives. We recognize them immediately. Slide, please. A Greek temple, for instance, will remind us at first glance of the local First National Bank. Or a Greek statue will bring to mind countless other statues that we have seen in the parks. But this air of familiarity is not an unmixed blessing. We would do well to keep in mind that the continuous tradition which links us with the Greeks is a handicap as well as an advantage. If we are to get an unhampered view of Greek architecture, we must take care not to be swayed by our memories of the First National Bank, and in judging Greek sculpture, we had better forget its latter-day descendants in the park. Slide, please. Another complication peculiar to the study of Greek art arises from the fact that we have 3 separate and sometimes conflicting sources of information on the subject. They are, first of all, the monuments themselves. Then we have various copies made in Roman times which tell us something about important Greek works that would otherwise be lost to us entirely. These copies, however, always pose a problem. Some are, but faithfully they follow their model, especially if we have several copies all slightly different of the same original. Slide, please. And finally, there are the literary sources. The Greeks were the first people in history to write at length about their own artists, and their accounts were eagerly collected by the Romans, who handed them down to us. From them we learn what the Greeks themselves considered their most important achievements in architecture, sculpture, and painting. Slide, please. Who were the Greeks? We have met some of them before, the Mycenaeans. Other Greek-speaking tribes entered the peninsula from the north toward 1100 BC. We do not know how many separate tribal units there were in the beginning, but two main groups stand out. The Dorians, D-O-R-I-E-N-S, who settled mostly on the mainland, and the Ionians, who inhabited the Aegean Islands and the nearby coast of Asia Minor. Despite a strong sense of kinship based on language and common beliefs, the Greeks remained divided into many small, independent city-states. The intense rivalry of these states, militarily, politically, and commercially, undoubtedly stimulated the growth of ideas and institutions. Slide, please. The formative phase of Greek civilization embraces about 400 years, from 1100 BC to 700 BC. Of the first 3 centuries of this period, we know very little. But after about 800 BC, the Greeks rapidly emerged into full light of history. The earliest specific dates that have come down to us are from that time, 776 BC, the founding of the Olympic Games, and the starting point of Greek chronology. Slide, please. That time also saw the full development of the oldest characteristically Greek style in the fine arts, the so-called geometric. We know it only from painted pottery and small-scale sculpture. Monumental architecture and sculpture in stone did not appear until the 7th century. At first, the pottery had been decorated only with abstract designs, triangles, checkers, concentric circles, but toward 800 BC, human and animal figures began to appear within the geometric framework, and in the most mature examples, these figures could form elaborate scenes. Our specimen belongs to a group of very large vases that served as grave monuments. Its bottom has holes through which liquid offerings could filter down to the dead below. Did the Greeks then have no conception of a hereafter? They did, but the realm of the dead to them was a colorless, ill-defined region where souls, or shades as they called them, led a feeble and passive existence without making any demands upon the living. Slide, please. If the Greeks nevertheless marked and tended their graves and even poured libations over them, they did so in a spirit of pious remembrance rather than to satisfy the needs of the dead. Slide, please. The artist who painted our vases achieved an astonishingly varied effect. The spacing of the bands, their width and density, show a rather subtle relationship to the structure of the vessel. His interest in representation, however, is as yet very limited. The figures or groups, repeated at regular intervals, are little more than another kind of ornament, part of the same overall texture, so that their size varies in accordance with the area to be filled. Slide, please. Lozenges indicate legs, whether of a man, a chair, or a bier. Circles with dots may or may not be human heads. Slide, please. Toward 700 BC, the dam finally bursts. New forms come flooding in, and the Greek art enters another phase, which we call the Orientalizing style. As its name implies, the new style reflects powerful influences from Egypt and the Near East, stimulated by increasing trade with these regions. Between 725 and 650 BC, Greek art absorbed a host of Oriental motifs and ideas and was profoundly transformed in the procedure. Slide, please. The change becomes very evident if we compare the large amphora, a two-handled storage jar, with the vase of 100 years earlier. Geometric ornament has not disappeared altogether, but it is confined to the peripheral zones, the foot, the handles, and the lip. New curvilinear motifs, such as spirals, interlacing bands, palmettes, and rosettes, are conspicuous everywhere. On the shoulder of the vessel, we see a frieze of fighting animals. The major areas, however, are given over to narrative, which has become the dominant element. The figures have gained so much in size and descriptive precision that the decorative patterns scattered among them can no longer interfere with their actions. Ornament of any sort now belongs to a separate and lesser realm. As a result, the blinding of the giant Polyphemus by Odysseus and his companions, the scene on the neck of the amphora, is enacted with memorable directness and dramatic force. If these men lack the beauty we expect of epic heroes, their movements have an expressive vigor that makes them seem thoroughly alive. Slide, please. The slaying of another monstrous creature is depicted on the body of the vase, the main part of which has been badly damaged so that only two figures have survived intact. They are Gorgons, the sisters of the snake-haired, terrible-faced Medusa, whom Perseus killed with the aid of the gods. Even here we noticed an interest in the articulation of the body far beyond the limits of the geometric style. Slide, please. The Orientalizing phase of Greek art was a period of experiment and transition in contrast to the stable and consistent geometric style. Once the new elements from the East had been fully assimilated, however, there emerged another style, the archaic, A-R-C-H-A-I-C, which lasted from the later 7th century to about 480 BC. During the archaic period, we witnessed the unfolding of the artistic genius of Greece, not only in vase painting, but also in monumental architecture and sculpture. While archaic art lacks the balance, the sense of perfection of the classical style of the later 5th century, it has a freshness that gives it particularly strong appeal, especially for the modern beholder. Slide, please. In vase painting, there was no break in continuity. The significance of archaic vase painting is in some ways completely unique. Decorated pottery, however great its value as an archaeologist's tool, rarely enters into the mainstream of the history of art. Yet, we cannot escape the feeling that they are among the most ambitious works of art of their day. Archaic vases are generally a good deal smaller than their predecessors, since pottery vessels no longer served as grave monuments. Slide, please. Greeks themselves valued the beauty of this vessel, is evident from the fact that after the middle of the 6th century, the finest vases frequently bear the signatures of the men who made them. Archaic vase painting thus introduces to us the first clearly defined personalities in the entire history of art. All archaic painting was essentially drawing filled in with solid, flat color. From 475 to 450 BC, vase painting became a lesser art, since depth and modeling were beyond its limited technical means. And by the end of the 5th century, its decline was obvious. Slide, please. The difference between orientalizing and archaic vase painting is one of artistic discipline. In the amphora seen earlier, the figures are shown partly as solid silhouettes, partly in outline, or as a combination of both. Toward the end of the 7th century, Attic, A-T-T-I-C, vase painters resolved these inconsistencies by adopting the black-figured style, which means that the entire design is silhouetted in black against the reddish clay. Internal details are scratched in with the needle, and white and purple may be added on top of the black to make certain areas stand out. The virtues of this procedure, which favors a decorative two-dimensional effect, are apparent in the figure of a drinking cup made around 540 BC. The slender, sharp-edged forms have a lace-like delicacy, yet also resilience and strength, so that the composition adapts itself to the circular surface without becoming mere ornament. Dionysus reclines in his boat. The sail was once entirely white. It moves with the same ease as the dolphins, whose light forms are counterbalanced by the heavy clusters of grapes. But why is he at sea? According to a Homeric hymn, the god of wine had once been abducted by pirates, whereupon he caused vines to grow all over the ship and frightened his captors until they jumped overboard and were turned into dolphins. We see him here on his return journey, accompanied by 7 dolphins and 7 bunches of grapes for good luck. Slide, please. The silhouette-like black figured technique made the study of foreshortening unduly difficult. For in some vases, they tried the reverse procedure, leaving the figures red and filling in the background. This red figure technique gradually replaced the older method toward 500 BC. Slide, please. The details are now freely drawn with the brush rather than laboriously incised, so the artist depends far less on the profile view than before. Instead, he exploits the internal lines of communication that permit him to show boldly foreshortened and overlapping limbs, precise details of costume, and interesting facial expressions. Slide, please. He is so fascinated by all these new effects that he has made the figures as large as he possibly could. They almost seem to burst from their frame. Slide, please. No less remarkable is the expressive freedom of the draftsmanship. The lines are as flexible as if they had been done with a pen. Slide, please. New motifs that distinguish the orientalizing style from the geometric, fighting animals, winged monsters, scenes of combat, had reached Greece mainly through the importation of ivory carvings and metalwork from Phoenicia or Syria, which reflected Mesopotamian as well as Egyptian influences. Slide, please. Such objects have actually been found on Greek soil, that we can regard this channel of transmission as well established. Slide, please. Slide, please. They do not help us, however, to explain the rise of monumental architecture and sculpture in stone